So this side event will be focused on some policy actions that we have seen in different parts of the world that have been shown to be effective in ensuring an effective and equitable transition to sustainable mobility on an urban, national, and perhaps regional level. And this is especially critical in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have also seen policy changes in the respacing of cities, accessibility, and also in the transport workforce. And as the sector evolves to be more decarbonized, digitalized, and under increasing climate pressure, we hope that there will be more actions that we could actually implement to different cities and in different countries. So without further ado, I will now give the floor to our first presenter, Meliti Fernando from the International Transport Forum, who will share some of the policy scenarios that have been developed in the ITF Transport Outlook 2021. Meliti, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Wei-Xuan. I believe everyone should be able to see my slides. Is that correct? Yes, okay, I'm seeing nods. Excellent. Hi, everyone. My name is Meliti Fernando, and I'm delighted to kick off this side event by sharing with you some key findings and policy insights from our recent ITF Transport Outlook. Now, particularly because this year's theme focused on how we can create more equitable social outcomes while also transitioning to more environmentally sustainable transport. And of course, all of this was looked at in the context of COVID-19 recovery. To give you some background on the Transport Outlook, it's published every 2 years and it presents estimates for the evolution of transport demand and emissions under different policy scenarios. This presentation will be focused on the topic of equity, but if you're interested in learning about the wider impacts, sector-specific insights, etc., our website has multiple resources that might be helpful. Now, I'll first start off with a quick summary about the three policy scenarios that we model in this publication. You'll see these names pop up in the rest of the slides. They represent 3 different levels of ambition when it comes to decarbonizing transport. The first, Recover, looks at a return to our current policy trajectory. It tracks where we might end up if governments follow through on existing commitments from prior to the pandemic, but make very little progress beyond that. Reshape offers a completely different trajectory. The commitments we assume coming out of the pandemic are going to be transformational, and there's a focus on green recovery going far beyond any original commitments. In Reshape Plus, we identify where there's certain travel behaviors that we noticed during the pandemic or economic stimulus packages coming afterwards that could be leveraged to boost some of the policies that we saw in Reshape and front load implementation during this recovery period. So we'll first take a look at some of the trends that we expect to see in the transport sector in the coming decades, and then we'll talk about how we might influence them to positively impact communities and transition to more sustainable mobility. Starting off with demand for transport. Under our current level of policy ambition, we expect to see demand for passenger travel and the movement of goods more than double from 2015 to 2050. The dip in 2020 was temporary, and I'm sure you've already witnessed that. And much of this growth in passenger and freight demand is driven by population growth and increasing prosperity and quality of life around the world. This is compounded to a certain extent because the regions experiencing the greatest population growth are also the regions of rapid economic growth. And so this is a good thing that more and more people around the world will newly have the ability and the means to travel, which brings up the big question: how do we meet demand sustainably and ensure that people still have access to opportunities that they wish to access? And on a different side, is all this demand necessary? And we'll come back to that. Meeting demand under our current level of policy ambition means that, measured as CO2 equivalents, the transport sector will see a 16% growth in emissions by 2050. Now, of course, this is the wrong direction. This would overshoot the level we need to have a chance of limiting global warming by 1.5 degrees by about 3 times come 2050. So clearly not an option. But before we move on to what we need to do to change this, we would be remiss if we didn't consider where these emissions are coming from. Of course, when we look at global warming, the total emissions are what matters. But when it comes to identifying where responsibility may lie in generating emissions and perhaps leading the charge to decarbonize the sector, we see a strong correlation between the regions that generate the highest GDP per capita and where individuals emit the most transport emissions. The regions here on this graph are in order of GDP per capita, highest to lowest. The good news here is that, of course, these are also the world regions with the capital and the technological means to take a leading role in reducing emissions. So how do we move from this somewhat grim picture to what is possible with strong commitments and action? When we launched this publication, we presented these 6 high-level policy takeaways. And while they're all very important, I want to focus on 4 of them today and discuss specifically how they pertain to a just transition. First off, we need to raise ambition to reverse CO2 emission growth. We are all well aware of the consequences of global warming beyond the 1.5 degrees, sea levels rising and affecting coastal communities, extreme weather events, and rising temperatures threatening human health. It is clear that decarbonization is a social issue. This graph clearly shows that if we continue to act in line with our current efforts, it's not going to be enough to hit the CO2 reductions we need. In the lead up to COP26, as countries are revising their commitments to their nationally determined contributions, we hope to see this greater ambition reflected. Because with high ambition and action to follow that up, in line with something like the reshape type policy scenario that you see in the light blue, we have a chance of just about meeting these carbon targets. And the reshape plus scenario in the green could help reach these goals faster and with greater certainty, ultimately reducing emissions by about 70%. But what does this higher ambition look like in practice? Are all countries supposed to implement the same actions? Well, no, there are a number of local and regional characteristics to take into account. But at a very high level, if we consider the patterns in the OECD and the non-OECD countries, we can observe some general trends in regions with more developed economies, such as the OECD countries, and developing countries where we expect to see faster economic growth. This slide is showing you transport demand and emissions per capita for passenger travel in urban areas. The solid lines here are the current trajectory, and the dotted lines are the most ambitious scenario. You can see that both demand and emissions per person are much higher in developed regions. Moving forward, developed regions will need to reduce their current very high demand for transport by identifying where there is travel in excess of what is necessary. This is coming back to that question I asked earlier. This will involve reversing unsustainable patterns of sprawling city growth, reducing reliance on private cars, for example. Developing regions cannot reduce their growth on average because as many people improve their quality of life in a way that allows them to access places they may not have been able to afford before, or where services or infrastructure doesn't exist. However, by leapfrogging the patterns that developed economies are now trying to undo, developing regions could really focus on a different ideal, looking for these mixed-use communities within cities that don't design for the private car as an ideal, and instead focuses on shared mobility, for example. Paired with other measures, if this is to happen, emission rates may actually converge, as you can see on the right. I want to point out here before we move on that this is a very high-level assessment comparing groups of countries, since this is really speaking at a global level. But these discrepancies in demand and emissions exist within every country and within even cities. So actual implementation of policies really does need to take this into account. Which leads us to actually implementing policies. We strongly advocate for aligning environmental ambitions with the COVID-19 economic recovery policies we're seeing come out to ensure that together these policies work to create more equitable systems than we have had before. Now, it's quite easy to see why we need to do this. The status quo is that within countries, inequality is growing. These are the inequalities that people see and experience day to day. We've talked about the discrepancy in emissions and who actually suffers the consequences. Inequalities exist in transport access as well, which leads to inequalities in the types of opportunities people have access to. COVID-19 has exacerbated the economic losses, especially for those in precarious jobs. And the toll on public transport has meant that there's limited access, and there continues to be limited access for people reliant on it in some areas of the world. So what's the solution? Well, aligned action to make these interventions more cost-effective, appealing to the public, and ensuring that we actually meet them on a timely manner. Our results and recommendations in this outlook are a contribution to this. We, of course, look at decarbonization and other environmental factors. From an economic perspective, we need to also make sure that these measures create jobs, improve the economic efficiency of cities, and improve connectivity of people to jobs. From a social perspective, many focus on improving access for groups like children, older generations, women, people with any sort of mobility restriction, whose travel needs have been poorly catered to in our existing systems. And I also want to highlight that we talk about some of the measures, some of those decarbonization measures, especially ones involving pricing, where we need to consider with an understanding of the local context and exactly who will be affected and how to ensure that they're implemented fairly. One of the most important ways to align these goals and achieve these ambitions of equity is to move from mobility-focused policies to accessibility-focused policies. Now, accessibility-focused policies ensure that people have access to opportunities and goods as they need, without putting the focus on traveling more and traveling faster and generating more demand. These are policies to encourage denser neighborhoods where you can work and send your kids to school and shop and meet friends. And when you need to go elsewhere in the city, you have a reliable network of multimodal solutions to fit your individual needs and the type of trip that you are completing. Many of us got a glimpse of this perhaps during the pandemic when we walked and cycled more and some of our trips stayed closer to home. Others of us did not have this opportunity. Wouldn't it be convenient and also more inclusive if the destinations and services we needed were in close proximity to where we lived, simply by the way our cities were designed? This is where we have the opportunity to reduce transport activity while also maintaining accessibility. This is very different to the private car-centric model that we've adopted traditionally, which leads to building more and wider roads and inducing more and more car traffic. It takes into account the needs of people who don't have a car, and it's safer and more affordable. These principles apply to freight as well, moving from long supply chains and faster transport to consolidating loads and shorter supply chains that are more resilient to shocks. Lastly, I want to talk about technology and innovation. It is true that we need to shift away from fossil fuel-based technologies in order to do so, we need greater technological breakthroughs to decarbonize the sector. But we also need to ensure that the conversation around these flashier topics remains grounded in the reality that new technology is not a silver bullet and can very easily overlook the needs of wider population unless we are very intentional about it. We need to invest in developing new fuels and technologies. We need to focus on making them affordable and available quickly, and that the benefits of these are felt in all regions, given that there are benefits to the local environment that extend beyond CO2 reduction. For example, reductions in air pollution or noise pollution. We need to encourage their adoption by providing financial incentives and investing in public charging infrastructure, but it's crucial that we target a high use and shared vehicle fleet, such as delivery vehicles, buses, shared mobility, so that the greater public can reap the most benefits compared to simply focusing on private vehicles. Lastly, all regions need to decarbonize. Yet, as we saw earlier, some regions may have greater capital and greater technology just as a result of their historic economic benefits. We need to ensure that technologies are available to all and that there needs to be technology transfer mechanisms, global funding in partnership with developing regions, as well as capacity building to ensure that no one is left behind. So I'd like to close by summing up the policy recommendations that we discussed today. Number one, increase ambition because decarbonization is a social issue, and make sure that the strategies reflect the local context. Align economic recovery with decarbonization incentives and those to create more equitable transport systems. We can achieve this by focusing on accessibility rather than more travel. And lastly, we need to ensure that innovation keeps equity at the center and that we strive to improve technologies, but also make them affordable and available across the globe. Thank you very much for your time. I'll now hand back to Wei Xuan for the rest of our program.
Thank you very much, Meliti. And I wonder if there are any questions for Meliti before we move on to the panel discussion. No. Okay. So thank you again, Leti. And with that, I think we will be able to discuss some of the key policy insights that Melody has just shared with us, and to really go deeper to look at how governments and cities, as well as the private sector, could actually help support this just transition. And so we do have five speakers who are, or panelists who are joining us today to share their insights on policy actions for a sustainable and equitable transport transition. And so first, I'd like to invite Mr. Gustavo Rinaldi, who is the Environmental Impact Director of the Ministry of Transport of Argentina, to share his perspective from a national government's point of view, and also from the regional perspective. So what is the perspective of Latin America in general and Argentina in relation to the decarbonization of transport?
Okay, good morning, Wei. Good morning to all partners in the panel. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I initially want to thank ITF for the invitation to be part of this event within the framework of the second United Nations Conference of Sustainable Transport. I think that side events of the big conference like this one open a very relevant opportunity to exchange ideas about central issues of our region and our countries. In that order, I would like to highlight first that Argentine climate policy has as one of its fundamental pillars the transport sector, whose main actors, both public and private, are committed to the implementation of concrete measures aimed both at the reducing emission of CO2 generated by the activity, and as well to adapt its infrastructure and operation, trying to ensure the movement of goods and people, even in the worst climate scenario. We're firmly convinced that the decarbonization of transport in the new post-COVID normality will be a great engine for regional socioeconomic development and will enable the effective enjoyment of fundamental human rights, such as food, work, health, and education. An important point to consider initially is that we understand that the formulation of main axes of the sector's climate actions must be developed from a systemic and circumstantial analysis, which considers the particularities of each of the mobility and transport subsystems, introspectively review each of them, and bring them into dialogue with the other subsystems, all of the sake of greater holistic efficiency and in light of a well-known avoid, change, improve, and adapt approach. This systemic approach should not be limited to implications strictly related to the sector of each This systemic approach should not be limited to implications strictly related to the sector of each of the actions, but on the contrary, it necessarily must be extended in order to maximize the possible impact of each measure, such as the promotion of electric mobility on national and regional industrial development, the reduction of socioeconomic difference, structural and comprehensive improvement of the quality of life. It's also necessary to consider the particular conditions of our productive, scientific, academic, and working systems, as well as the special condition of our territories, which offers countries such as Argentina the possibility of having large, yet unexploited natural gas reserves, and also being one of the largest potential producers of green hydrogen in the region, and other types of renewable energies such as wind or solar. It is not possible to think that the same solutions can be applied as magic formulas to small countries with a little industrial tradition, as for example Chile, Uruguay in the region, than to nations like Brazil, Mexico, or Argentina, which associate more than 130,000 jobs with the automotive industry. So in this context, and based on the systemic conception, I think after the other presentation, we can mention some policies that we promoted from Argentina to address the challenges of climate changes. Sorry about, I'm reading, no, I'm Spanish speaking speaker, so my English is not the best. I choose to read. But well, I keep in touch if you need some acceleration or something that you can understand well.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. And I think you've touched upon a very important point on a change in the systematic level. And so we would actually need to conduct systematic analysis and to ensure that changes are happening in all levels. And so now we will go to a city level to really move on to look at urban cities and how cities have actually integrated different actions over the past few years. And so Mariela, I know that in the recent years, C40 cities has integrated several social programs to the support they offer to cities in decreasing their carbon emissions. So could you share a little bit about this shift in the organization's approach with us today? And before I forget, Mariana, you are the Zero Emission Program Manager of C40 cities. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone for attending the panel and to ITF for inviting us. So, very shortly, I think that at the end of the day, we are very aware that a climate change disproportionately affects the most vulnerable. So it only makes sense to include and put the disadvantaged kind of front and center the climate action agenda. C40's mission still is helping cities decrease their carbon emission and create healthier, more livable cities. But it's true that during recent years, C40 has also integrated a few additional programs, including, for instance, a project focused on empowering women entrepreneurs, which is called Women for Climate. Another one focused on elevating the youth's voice so they are present and they are heard in the venues and global meetings that will define their future. And we have also grown our inclusive climate action team and program to offer this kind of cross-cutting support to all C40 programs and make sure that all the policies that we recommend to our 100 cities are inclusive and equitable.
Thank you very much. And it will be great if we could learn a little more about some of these initiatives, but I think what you have covered is really some of the vulnerable groups that would actually need additional support and of course to bring in the youth community to actually help make transformative changes. And so next we will actually invite Mr. John Pritchard from the International Transport Forum to share some of his recent work on the allocation of space in cities. So again, from an urban context, how could we actually allocate space in a more efficient and more sustainable way? So John, why should space consumption be incorporated into policy and appraisal assessments to deliver more just outcomes?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the question, Wei-Xuan. I think space in general, and especially the space on our streets that is allocated for our mobility and to provide accessibility to different opportunities, is a scarce commodity in dense urban settings. It serves a broad range of purposes, and there's really an inherent tension in how we allocate this contested space. So right now, what we generally see is that this space is allocated to highly space-consuming transport modes like the private vehicles, despite the fact that we know that the space consumed, for example, by a driver in a car in terms of passenger kilometers is several orders of magnitude larger than by any other mode. And additionally, what makes it especially problematic or especially concerning is the fact that more than 90% of the space is really static space while the car is parked somewhere on our streets without properly being accounted for. So as we sit here today and we're discussing about equitable and just transitions to transport policies, right? We really need to think not only about greening our infrastructure, not only about reducing the carbon intensity of our vehicles through technological innovation and progress, but also when we're encouraging modal shift, we need to really take a critical look at how we're allocating the space in our cities and try to put people first, I would say, right? We need to frame this around how does space serve the people, how does space serve citizens, and not on how vehicles use this space. So we really shouldn't be planning for vehicles or specific types of modes, but we really should be planning for the people. Now, this is especially important because the accessibility that a system provides is a direct result of our policies and our decisions. And this means that when we have unjust outcomes, it's our responsibility to address this. And now, this tension around space, when we have all these different types of new modes that are popping up in all of our cities, further reinforces the need to do this better. We have a lot of shared modes, we have a lot of micromobility alternatives that are racing around our cities. And it's important to consider how these allocate to space, how we allocate the space to these new modes. And we need to think about how trip purposes can be served effectively by different modes. What are the space consumption needs to provide this mobility? And of course, the environmental concerns behind this. However, we always have to keep in mind that the need for the reallocation of space, I'm sorry, is going to be different in different contexts and for different parts of the city. So the needs of space and how we should allocate the space in our peripheries should not be the same as in our urban cores. Now, if we want to have more just outcomes in the city, I think it's really imperative that we look at appropriate space consumption indicators when we're assessing our policies, when we're assessing our appraisals. And I think we really need to start exploring potentials for limited dynamic demand variable reallocation of certain space. However, when we have all these different modes and we have this shared space, we always have to keep in mind that when you have lots of different modes at different speeds, you really increase the likelihood of conflicts and accidents. So you always have to have safe system principles when you're reallocating the space, because at the end of the day, we want our cities to be safe for all our participants. Thank you very much, Wei Xuan.
Thank you very much, John. And I think the point that you've made about how to allocate space more efficiently and more sustainably with the emerging new modes that we're seeing in recent years, I think that's also very critical. And I think it brings us to our next speaker, Mr. Richard Cully from Arrival. And so we know that Arrival is a sustainable mobility startup, and you've made immense progress since you have started and introduced your innovative technologies in the sector. And so could you tell us a little more about how electric vehicles are deployed in the most underserved communities? And we would like to invite Mr. Richard Cully, who is the Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs from Arrival. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation today to speak, and it's been a great discussion so far. I think my intro I'm going to skim over because Meliti did such a great, covered all of the points that I was going to say around the areas that we need to focus on equitable transport. And so at Arrival, so we do have a complete ecosystem of products and data and services so that an entire city could electrify its transportation system in a sustainable and equitable way. We have focused all of our product development towards mass and shared transportation. And so our first products are going to be a battery electric transit bus, a battery electric last mile delivery, and then also we announced we have a partnership with Uber where we're developing then a shared, a rideshare based vehicle. So we're really trying to get everybody out of personal mobility into shared transportation. As we then start to work with cities and governments and policymakers, trying to make sure that we deploy and we prioritize those segments of the transportation system that are the most polluting. And so as we come up with those ambitious targets and incentives and to promote fleets and municipal governments to transition, making sure that those clean and safer vehicles are going into those communities that are most underserved. And we're not deploying battery electric buses in the sort of the downtown areas or in areas that aren't impacted by particulate and NOx emissions as those neighborhoods and communities that are closest to highways. In addition, one of the other arrival technologies is our approach to manufacturing. And so we've developed what we call the microfactory. This is a much smaller footprint that builds up our vehicles in a very modular way. This means that we can place our microfactories in areas close to cities. We then partner with those cities to develop a range of workforce development programs, a number of community engagement to make sure that those local communities that would typically not have that economic benefit of manufacturing and those environmental benefits can get that positive impact. And so we work throughout that city to make sure that they get that access and we have those impacts go to those communities, so that we are then building vehicles for that local market, using local labor, and then trying to move as much of our supply chain into that local area. So everybody benefits not just from the deployment of clean vehicles in their city and benefits from the health benefits, but then also can benefit from economically.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I see that Gustavo has raised your hand. Do you have a...
Yeah, wait, I have a question for Richard. I've been researching what was arrival, and really we are from Argentina thinking about transforming the last mile through electric. No, I think that's the segment of the transport that electric vehicles must go on first in cities. In that order, I would like, what chances of installing microfactories in South America are you seeing? What conditions there have to be to think about that? Of if you are thinking about microfactories just in Europe or in North America. I love the van. Your electrical van is lovely. So I would like to bring it to Argentina. That's how can we do that?
Of course, and Gustavo, yeah, we should certainly have a conversation outside of the panel, but yeah, we are going through and working with international governments and with cities all around the world as we identify our sort of next phase of microfactories. So these microfactories, they can produce up to 10,000 of the vehicles, of the vans, or up to 1,000 buses. And so the idea here is that we do scale them around the world, again, to produce those vehicles for those local markets. Also means that we don't have that one large central manufacturing location and then shipping large vehicles internationally. So from a CO2 perspective, we get to save a lot from sort of transportation emissions. And so we take this very much a life cycle approach. And so when we work with governments, again, we do look at, within a city, we look at those like opportunity or development zones in those neighborhoods, so that, again, we can place these in areas that would be most impacted from an economic perspective, whether it's for new job creation, upward mobility, GDP uplift for that local community, and then ultimately deploying the vehicles in that neighborhood, so that again, we can get those most polluting vehicles off the road. So yeah, we're looking at this on a very much a global perspective. Certainly North America and Europe are our focus for the next 18 months as we scale up our production, and then very quickly after we'll be in very many different places, including South America.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll move on to our next panelist, Ms. Alexandra Cruz Ross, who is the transport specialist at the International Labor Organization. So Alexandra will be sharing some of her insights on the labor's front. And I think this could also be relevant to the micro factories that was the idea of micro factories that was introduced by Richard. And so, Alexandra, what is the ILO doing in terms of just transition and green jobs?
Thank you, Wei Shuen. It's a pleasure here to be supporting your work, and thank you for the invitation to the ITF. I think first I will start by describing very shortly the ILO, because perhaps our audience might not be familiar with our work. So the ILO, the International Labor Organization, basically promotes jobs and protects people. And it's an international regulatory agency that is part of the United Nations system, but it predates it, as it was born from the ashes of World War I. And one of our founding principles is that universal lasting peace can only be established if it is based on social justice. And we have a tripartite structure that brings together workers, employers, and governments. And the mandate of our agency is the world of work, and we promote our mandate through the decent work agenda. And decent work is actually included in the 2030 agenda and puts people at the center of development. The ILO not only promotes employment, but work of quality through its decent work agenda that is structured around 4 pillars: employment creation, social security and social protection, social dialogue and collective bargaining, and international standards and fundamental principles and rights at work. And we also have a range of cross-cutting policy drivers, including gender equality, non-discrimination, and a just transition and environmental sustainability, and tripartism, for example. But we are talking here about sustainable transport, and probably you're wondering how we integrate this decent work agenda into issues of green jobs and green transitions. So we actually have the Green Jobs program that is based in the Enterprises Department. And the ILO promotes green jobs as part of decent work. And in this way, jobs are connected with sustainable development, people well-being, and healthy organizations. And the ILO adopted some recommendations already on green jobs since 2013. And later, through a meeting of experts, it adopted guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. That's the whole title. And they were adopted in November 2015 by the ILO governing body. Also, I wanted to highlight that in 2019, the ILO issued a report on skills for a greener future. And the ILO defines green jobs as decent jobs that contribute to preserve or restore the environment, be they in traditional sectors such as manufacturing or construction, or in new and emerging sectors such as renewable energy and energy efficiency. And in general, these green jobs help to improve energy and raw materials efficiency, limit greenhouse gas emissions, minimize waste pollution, and protect and restore ecosystems, and support generally in the adaptation to climate change. Now, the guidelines on just transition seek to also remediate the situation where certain categories of workers with the potential to have green jobs work in unsafe and unhealthy conditions with limited opportunities to improve their livelihoods. So we're looking here at a tool that for the greening and upping of the quality of employment of these workers. And the guidelines are based on evidence and lessons learned from the country level policies and sectoral strategies geared towards environmental sustainability, the greening of enterprises, social inclusion, and the promotion of green jobs. And you can find them in the ILO website, the guidelines. So now the next step is really applying them at a sector specific level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we know that ILO has indeed developed a series of guidelines and which have been very, very helpful, especially during the pandemic and in the wake of the pandemic as countries start to recover. And we will definitely come back to some of these guidelines. And so now we will go back to Gustavo, and just now that you have heard so our panelists sharing their insights, and I wonder if you could also share some of the specific measures that have been developed and for the transport sector in Argentina to address some of the sustainability issues, including the climate crisis.
Yes, way. First of all, I really, it's a very important point what Alejandra said about the laboral world. I think we are very worried about the green jobs in Argentina. I was telling that in my intervention about how the workers come together with the technology. We are very concerned about that, and a very important industry in Argentina in the electric vehicles. About the measures you were asking. First of all, we are promoting sustainable urban transport planning at the subnational level. You know, we understand that the promotion of active mobility, the improvement of public transport to encourage its use, and the reduction of unnecessary trips must be promoted for the national state. Accompanying the local state with technical, legal, and economic tools which are consistent to enable the development of plans according to their own customs and realities. It's very important to highlight in this point the joint work we are doing in this regard with ITF, with the Whipper Institute, with CNCED, FFD, and other international actors willing to provide technical collaboration for such purposes. However, it's also necessary to mention that we are aware that the objective of improving transport planning by 2030 in the 80 cities with more than 50,000 inhabitants that Argentina has will be very difficult to achieve without greater financial support from the most of the developed countries. And that's a relevant point. I have another measures we are planning. You know, I think another very relevant measure is thinking about efficient use of energy in the transport sector. We consider it necessary to deepen the past travel in the relation to incorporating eco-driving measures in the automotive cargo sector. It's very cost effective, that sort of measure. So we are trying to reformulate the existing programs and expanding them to other modes, such as the rail or public transport, the public passenger transport. Likewise, we have proposed to advance in the generation of renewable energy in the structural node of transport, such as railway stations, airports, ports, logistics distribution center. I think that's a necessary measure, not just to reduce emissions, but also for education, no, for the rest of the society. If you install solar panels in train stations or in some terminal, people start to know the technology, start to get friendly with the technology. I think it's very important in that way. Beside the reducing of emissions, it have attached. And the other important measure is about electromobility. I think Argentina is concerned and is commitment to transit to the electromobility in some sectors, in some segments of the transport. As I was telling, it's very important for me to emphasize that Argentina is not willing to be a mere spectator, which limits itself to importing 100% electric vehicles produced abroad. That was why I was asking Richard about the possibility of produce electric vehicles in Argentina or producing buses. We don't want just to import buses or vans, or we want to be part of the supply chain of the market, you know. We have that relation with what we was telling about Alejandra and the laboral market. No, it's part of the just transition. We have a very relevant industry, and we can't just think about importing vehicles. We have to think how the transition to mobility, to electric mobility, helped our people to have a better quality of life. No, I think that relation is very important for the region and for our country in particular. And at least, but not at last, but not at least, the adoption. I think the adoption of the sector to climate change is one issue the sector can omit. No, I think it's very important. We are seeing now the impacts of climate change. The Paraná River in Argentina has the lowest level, the historic lowest level. We are seeing each days fires which affect the air navigation, the transport, the freight transport in our roads, the security of the workers. Again, it's the security and thinking about the people who works in the sector, not just for the climate, focusing in workers. This is something we are very worried about from the Ministry of Transport. So I think that's it for now. This is 3 or 4 measures that we are pointing very, very, very important. I think it's very important, and that's why in that small time and I'm trying to be more fluid in my English. We can highlight now.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. And I think we will definitely come back to this point about workers. You have mentioned that this is a concern at the Ministry of Transport of Argentina, and I think this is a very critical topic that should definitely be on the table when we're talking about decarbonization or sustainable transport development in general, because this is a sector that will be very much affected, and a sector that will require more upskilling and perhaps reskilling and retraining. And I know that we'll hear more from Alexandra in a moment. But before that, I would like to go back to Mariola with C40 Cities. Could you share some of your insights specifically in transport, the type of policies that cities are implementing to make the transition to sustainable transport more equitable?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I think that C40's perspective on how to promote more equitable and sustainable transition is very aligned with some of the notions that other panelists have shared already. So Malithi was mentioning during her presentation this concept of moving from a mobility model to an accessibility model, and trying to have all the different destinations at an accessible kind of distance. That concept a little bit of the 15-minute city. We always say that the best transportation strategy is a good land use planning. If you plan a city that is designed to have all type of services in a walk or cycling distance, everything just became so much easier. Also, John was mentioning before that how the public space should be allocated much more equitably, because obviously cars take up in some cities today more than 60% of the public space, and we know that remain parked for more than 80% of the time. So obviously from C40 we promote transportation strategies that have to do with walking, with cycling, and mass transportation, because all of them inherently, by definition, are already sustainable, are already the most equitable, because they are the most affordable and they are the most accessible. Now, I think that the trick or the difficult part becomes when we try to promote access to electric vehicles, for instance, because traditionally electric vehicles have a reputation for, like being targeted to white rich men. And I think that cities are trying to debunk that myth a little bit, because with more and more models becoming available, I think that there are more than 350 today in the US, the market developing at a very fast pace, as well as the technology, we are starting to see more electric vehicles that meet the different needs of, like different lifestyles and different budgets. And cities are aware that despite promoting walking and cycling and mass transit, some trips will still have to be made by private transport. And so what's important is that those car trips are electrified or are zero emission. They are the minimum, but they need to be zero emission. And so what we are seeing, for instance, some cities trying to promote access to electric vehicles among low-income populations. Los Angeles has implemented Blue LA, which is a car sharing program that has been working in the city for the last 5 years. It has been recently expanded and targets explicitly low-income communities. More than the 100 car sharing stations and charge points are located within low-income neighborhoods, and low-income households have a discounted rate to access this service if you compare it with the standard membership fee, for instance. So that's a way in which, like the city is trying to promote the access of low-income communities to this type of technology. But obviously, there are others as well. So, and they are not always just the city's responsibility. So if we go to London, for instance, a big part of a city's decarbonization strategy passes by transforming fleets of taxis and ride-hailing vehicles, because obviously they are high mileage vehicles. It just makes sense. It's just like a huge investment to upgrade those vehicles before you upgrade privately owned vehicles. Just looking at the number of miles that they drive on a normal day. So London has expanded their ultra low emission zone, covering most of central London. This expansion is being effective by the end of this month, which means that a large part of the city will only be accessible by ride-hailing vehicles that are either hybrid or electric. That puts a lot of pressure on, obviously, Uber drivers that are among the most affluent residents in the city. Even so, if you consider the COVID impact that they have had, because whatever their economic situation was before the pandemic, it has taken a severe hit. So how Uber is also trying to support this transition? Well, by the clean air fee that basically allows Uber drivers to save up a few cents on a passenger mile, so they can save up enough money to upgrade their vehicle to an electric one using basically a discounted offering that Uber has. So at the end of the day, what we're seeing is cities trying to basically approach the technology to low-income communities, but also the private sector making and taking their part. Obviously, I'm not saying that Uber is not interested in pushing that for economic reasons. They are not only doing that like from their, from a purely non-economic reason, let's say, but it just makes sense for them in so many terms. So these are just a couple of examples, and I think that we could, expand that list if we were to go to, for example, scrappage schemes, right? That many cities have also in place, and that benefit low-income families that trade their old polluting vehicle for a high rate or full electric one. And we have cases in London and Barcelona and many other cities. So just a few examples of policies that we see in cities being successful at making sure that electric vehicles are not only seen and used by the affluent residents in the city, but are also being used by and also being used by by social and economic groups that maybe don't have a direct access to this technology.
Thank you very much, Marilla. And I see that Richard, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Marilla, I think very well said. A question, I guess, coming from the private side with cities, the thing that we always look for is data. And so how do we approach this? And maybe also for John at that very hyper street level, how do we get that data so that we can, first of all, what data do you need from the private companies to help those planning purposes? And then how do we sort of promote that data sharing the opposite way so that we know where are those sort of most underserved communities, where is the best location for a zero emission zone, for example? Have sort of C40 in ITF, are you thinking around how do we create that flow of data so that we can maximize the deployment of EVs to benefit people?
Sure. I don't know, John, if you want to go first, or I can go.
Please, Mariola, you can start. So,
in terms of electric vehicles, an example, just following the Uber case. Cities up until now have focused on implementing charging infrastructure in a way that is as visible as possible, right? They wanna make sure that residents see them and they feel relieved, and they feel like making a switch to an electric vehicle is actually a real alternative, because I want range anxiety just decreases. I see charging points here and there. Now, the strategy that cities have followed up until now focus on just giving visibility to charge points is not really matched by the utilization that we are seeing in those charge points, right? What could be most useful for a city right now trying to roll out charging infrastructure? Well, for instance, in the case, as I was saying, of Uber, knowing where the drivers live, what type of routes they take. This is information that private sector is not sharing, not even at an aggregated level. But what we know is that for ride-hailing drivers to really consider switching to an electric vehicle, they have to have at-home charging or near-home charging, because that's what makes the technology cost-effective. Being able to charge overnight at a decreased rate. Charging during the day means that they lose on journeys, means that they have to pay a higher fee because they need to stop at a private or publicly owned charger. So it makes so much more sense for them to charge overnight. Despite that, cities don't have that type of information, and private sector is not really interested so far, or at least so far has been, in sharing some sort of heat maps of where drivers live. For instance, that would be one way of sharing data that could smooth the transition, because we know that ride-hailing drivers are an anchor client of charge points, and that they would increase the utilization, they would make business models much more profitable. And so that could create some sort of a, like a virtuous cycle. So that's just an example from me. John?
Yeah, thank you very much. In addition to that, I agree with a lot of the points you made, and I want to highlight that here at the ITF, for us, it's really important to have evidence-based policies, and we need to be able to know what we're measuring. So, for example, in terms of our space usage consumption work that we've been doing, for us, it's really important just to measure, to have, to decide what are the best methods to measure this mobility-related space consumption that we have, right? So, for example, if a car is parked for 24 hours, 10 hours of the day out of the 24, occupying 4 square meters of space, this really should be multiplied to the time. So we really have to incorporate this temporal component to this usage. What our work has also found is that, these shared alternatives that we have now, these ride hailing, they can really minimize the impact of the space usage, because they have less time parked, less time idling, and they could have massive impacts. But if we want to have even better data, it would be, good to know really how many trips are being done in the day, how much of it, what is the passengers that you have, right? Are these 3 people? Because again, the space consumption, we can think about it in general terms, but we can bring it down to, per passenger, per individual, per trip, right? So the space usage accounting for all these different things, I think this is where a lot of these ride-hailing apps and sharing opportunities have a lot of chance. Because again, I want to highlight this again, what we find is, for example, for the private vehicle, more than 90% of a space usage throughout the day is related to the static use of space while they're parked or idling or waiting. Now, you also mentioned about this charging points. And I think, again, when we're thinking about where we're setting these charging points, is not only the part of the city, but which part of the street are we setting it in? So if we're taking this space to set it up, should this be coming from the space that's currently allocated for the cars, or should this be coming into the spaces allocated to in our sidewalks for our, our pedestrians or our mobility? And a lot of times what we see in cities, again, they want to make it visible, but then they take up the very little amount of space that's dedicated to pedestrians. So we have to be really careful there, and we have to balance all these different things. And I think that, as you say, having access to data, and I think is really important. And I think we need collaboration between private parties and governments and cities at different levels to try to get the best possible outcomes. Thank you.
And John, perhaps just to follow up on your last point, maybe you could just elaborate more. And I think this will be the second question for you in the panel discussion. So what are some considerations to apply dynamic variable relocation of space? So you have mentioned some of the constraints or pertaining to private vehicles, but are there other dynamic variables that we need to be mindful of?
Sure. Thank you very much again for this question. I think, first of all, so we're talking about like dynamic reallocation of space, I want to be very clear what we're talking about, right? We're talking about changing the use of our streets throughout the day in a temporary dynamic way to address the needs of the population and of the modes that they're using to travel. As Mariola already mentioned, land use tends to be quasi-permanent. It takes very, very long time to make land use changes. And even within the streets, once a space has been allocated for a particular use, it tends to remain in that state for a very, very long time, right? And this is despite the fact that we know that the needs of different transport modes and for different vehicles varies throughout the day, right? So the need for a freight vehicle is different at different parts of the day, right? The needs of any sort of vehicle varies across the day, but despite this, we have really, really static use of the space. I think that, as I already mentioned, I think we have to incorporate the use of space at all levels, include the dynamic space and the static space, because the vehicle has if you're going to use a particular vehicle for a particular mode, it's not just while you're using the vehicle, but it's what's the vehicle doing the rest of the day, right? Is it just standing there? Is it not standing there? And I think that another important consideration, right, is that, I mean, a lot of our work here is coming from micro-simulation exercises. Obviously, you cannot be changing the use of the road every 20 minutes because it would be a complete mess. It would make people unsafe. But we do need to incorporate these new modes of transport that we have in our cities to make it more efficient, right? Now, that means that we need this demand response to be somewhat limited, right? Because again, the highest thing is we want our population to be safe while they're traveling. And when you have different modes at different speeds at the same time, you have more possibility of conflict. So one key challenge is that if we're reallocating space, we need to have high levels of predictability. So we don't want anybody to be caught off guard when all of a sudden this road that was for the car, now bikes can go there. You need to be really, really careful about this, which means that we have to be really pointed in how we use it. And this, again, going back to Richard's point, we require data to understand our movements in our city for all these different purposes throughout the day. But I think that one thing that it will address both allowing people to know when these changes are going to happen and to predict when these changes are going to happen, and also to allow for all the users of our space to be safe, whether you're on a bicycle or you're a pedestrian or you're in a car in public transport, waiting for transport, whatever it may be, is that if we have default low and safe speeds, already we're addressing a lot of this issue. If everybody's traveling in the city at 30 kilometers an hour, it's a lot easier to maybe share the space between a bike and a car. If we have cars going 80 kilometers an hour in the city, and you also want pedestrians and you want cyclists to be there, it makes it much more difficult. So I think from a policy perspective, I think that if we have low and safe speeds as a default within our cities, this would really help address a lot of the issues that would be addressed by dynamically altering our cities and our space use. And of course, obviously, as I said, regardless of the usage of particular vehicles, it's never going to be active 24 hours a day. So we really need to maybe look into parking solutions that are more efficient during the low demand periods, while we minimize the amount of time that the vehicles are spending standing, but there's always going to be a component to this. Thank you, Wei-Xuan. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments from any of the other panelists.
Thank you very much. And we will perhaps come back to some of these points as well. But I would now like to give the floor to Richard. So we have heard Gustavo's questions and comments about the micro factories, flexible micro factories, and how they could actually benefit Argentina. And so perhaps, Richard, for your second question, you could share more with us on how does Arrival ensure that local communities can benefit economically and environmentally from manufacturing.
Thank you, and I think this sort of goes very much into the from the points that John was talking here, and so I think from that sort of deployment side, I think there's for me the data is what we need to drive this. And so all of our vehicles, as we get larger and larger fleets, they do have a range of data that we can generate, and it's then the intention that this will then be shared with cities so that it supports those types of efforts, both from a where are the areas within a city that we need to focus on from a deployment side, also from a safety side. When I'm not talking about electrification, I studied my career in safety, and so we're doing a lot of work here around Vision Zero on how do we provide that data and work with cities so that the transportation planners have that real-time data from vehicles so that they can address those safe areas within the city. Actually, if you go to our Medium website, I recently wrote a post called Making Safety Equitable that really goes into how we're approaching safety from that perspective. I think coming back into how do we make sure these are deployed, I think from a policy perspective, for me, instead of having a national government have broad open programs for incentivizing electric vehicle deployment through incentives and such, this is always welcome. I think there needs to be a good portion of this then gets passed down to the state and to the city level, because it's the city that knows where those most vulnerable populations are. And so it's at this stage where you then make sure that you are incentivizing not just the switch to electric vehicles for fleets and people, but also making sure that they are then deployed in those most underserved areas. And so the way that California does this through one of their electric vehicle voucher programs is to add on an extra 10 or 15% to that incentive amount when they're deployed in certain communities in California that have been most affected by emissions and by smog. And so I think there's a range of policies there to focus on how we make sure that vehicles are deployed in the right area. I think then from how do we make sure that people benefit also economically from the deployment of microfactories? Again, I think it's that's very hyper local data that would come from a city, from those economic development offices that can outline like where are those opportunity zones around a city or in a neighboring community. So again, we're not just placing a manufacturing or an arrival microfactory in an existing business park or an existing manufacturing location that has already seen those benefits. Let's try and target other communities that maybe wouldn't have had that chance otherwise. And so we look at a number of different factors there when we're selecting our microfactory locations, so that we do have this very holistic view of how do we benefit people locally. How do we then identify those communities that would benefit mostly from those sort of 250 to 300 green jobs, as was mentioned earlier. And so this is how we targeted our deployments within our first two microfactories in the United States around Charlotte, North Carolina. And it was very much that focus there. North Carolina was 50 out of 50 states in terms of upward mobility of their workforce. And so we're working with the communities directly around our microfactory there to make sure that those the people in these communities that wouldn't normally have had that opportunity to work in a high-tech manufacturing location get the training that they need, and then continue to have that training so that so that they can move up through the workforce and not come in at a base level and then not move up socio-economically. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think your points are also very relevant for our next panelist, Alexandra, who will also share some of IILO's guidelines pertaining to the sector, the transport sector. Mm-hmm. And so, Alexandra, you have mentioned that there is a sectoral approach when discussing the IILO's Just Transition guidelines. And so in what ways does the IILO work connected to the transport sector?
Thank you. Yes, so there are three main guidance documents that I would like to discuss today that connect actually this green and just transition agenda to the transport sector and regulatory sectoral approach. First, I'll mention a study that was carried out by the research department of the IILO, and then some regulatory work carried out here at the sectoral policies department in the road and urban transport sectors. So the first one is a recent study that we carried in conjunction with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's the PEP program, more specifically, that is on jobs in green and healthy transport, making the green shift. And it documents the case of a structural transformation of the transport sector that will be needed if environmentally sustainable green economies are to become a reality. And this could lead to the creation of millions of new jobs, as the study finds that 10 million additional jobs could be created worldwide and in the UNEC region. No? So the report examines the employment implications of 4 green transport scenarios in 56 countries in North America, Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia, which are all members of the UNEC. No? And it compares different scenarios, a business as usual approach with a scenario-based projections that run up to 2030. And these options envisage an accelerated expansion of public transport and the electrification of private passenger and freight transport. The report finds that the factors that could support job creation outside transport include increased spending on goods and services resulting from a reduction in spending on oil and measures related to the production and use of energy. The second document I would like to mention, and this is a regulatory tool, it's the IILO Guidelines on the promotion of decent work and road safety in the transport sector. So these international guidelines were adopted in 2019 through a meeting of experts, and they update 80 years of the IILO's regulatory work, applying for trucking and coach services, and focus on upping the quality of employment of drivers and tackling, on the other side, driver shortage. And of its 188 paragraphs, these guidelines deal with environmental and climate change in 4 of the paragraphs. So the first is a general statement in paragraph 36, where the tripartite constituents acknowledge that the greening of jobs and the promotion of green jobs, both in traditional and emerging sectors, will foster a competitive, low-carbon, environmentally sustainable economy and patterns of sustainable consumption and production, and will contribute to the fight against climate change. Then 2, in paragraph 52, it is requested from governments, social partners, that is workers and employers, and also the road transport contracting chain parties to establish initiatives jointly in collaboration and with national policies and actions and programs, including 1, formalization, the creation of enabling environments, and reform, but through social dialogue with workers, employers, and governments. Also upping the skills development framework and the professionalization of the sector, measures to green transport operations, including fleet renewal and eco-driving programs. Also, the road transport guidelines acknowledge in their paragraph 54 that policies and incentives in the road transport industry have the potential to exert influence in curbing GHG emissions. And it requests, again, the same parties to actively promote more efficient means of organizing loads and passengers, to minimize empty seats and runs, and that actually technology and digitalization could add benefits to facilitate this process. It requires for the development of skills and the training of drivers to minimize fuel consumption, such as eco-driving and the safe use of alternative fuels, and also the deployment of green vehicle technology that has been mentioned. All of these measures have actually been mentioned today, And finally, they make in paragraph 188 a reference to applying the principles contained in the guidelines I was mentioning on just transition. Now, from the urban passenger transport perspective, we just very recently, a month ago, held a technical meeting that adopted conclusions on the future of decent and sustainable work in urban passenger transport services. And these conclusions include a number of paragraphs on guidance on facilitating transition to formality and a just transition to decent and sustainable work. And you cannot really disassociate the concept of formalization from just transition. And I will come back in a couple of minutes to this crucial point. So first, the conclusions, the regulatory conclusions stress 1, that it refers to decarbonization. It should be led by the Just Transition Guidelines. It mentions, again, everything has to do with the enabling environment for enterprises, the governance environment for enterprises, professionalizations, and skills, But 1, you cannot disconnect really from social dialogue, collective bargaining, and fundamental principles and rights at work, because these are strong drivers for economic and social resilience and can actually reconcile competition, environmental goals, technological innovation with equitable access, decent work, and safety for workers and passengers by creating level playing fields. Also, we discuss about sustainable investment and responsible procurement, no? Focusing on the quality of the service, applying to all public and private contractors and subcontractors, no? This will contribute actually to a sustainable transport workforce. Now, I want to finish here my intervention with this specific order of ideas. So in many regions of the world, I think it's no secret that the sector is very fragmented. There's a lot of micro, small enterprises, owner operators, no? So the issues of just transitions cannot be disconnected from formalization. And generally, if we follow this train of thought, what is generally the first way of formalizing workers is Social Security. So Social Security programs are a successful tool for governments as an entry point to the formalization of informal drivers, owner operators, and informal service providers. And in this sense, the ILO has recommendations 202 and 204 that can assist workers, employers, and governments with Social Security floors and transitions to formalization. Because once formalized, you have more easily access to sustainable finance and these green funding programs that are necessary to fuel a just transition towards decent work and more environmentally sustainable transport. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And I think a lot of these guidelines, these examples they've just mentioned are definitely very valid to other points that other panelists have made, and I hope, Gustavo, this is also helpful for you as Argentina starts to plan for a more just transition to sustainable transport. So we only have a few minutes left, and I wonder if there are any questions from any participants.
No, just a short comment. I take note of Mariola about what can we do with cities in Argentina, and not just Buenos Aires. There's a lot of cities in Argentina, so I would like to keep in touch with her. Also, Alexandra, I take note of the inform. I was looking for it while you was talking. So again, I will try to keep in touch with you, and also Rachel. I think that was very useful for me to get in touch with them. Not Sean. Sean, I talked too much with Sean. Not with Sean, but yes, with Mariola, Alexandra, and Richard. It's really a pleasure for me as a government representative to hear about this point of view, and it's very useful. So thank you a lot.
Thank you.
It was a joke about Sean. It's a very good friend, Sean.
Yes, Richard, I saw that you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I was just also going to say, yeah, this is has really been a fascinating discussion. That's really the format of going from the national level all the way down to the sidewalk, and then the city and the labor perspective has been really enlightening. And I think I've got definitely a number of conversations with all of you, as we think about this from the private side, and how do we sort of build upon the progress that we've made to date, but really starting to make sure that we elevate equity in all of our programs going forward. So yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation today, and yeah, certainly look forward to the conversations and visiting Gustavo in Argentina soon with a microfactory.
Thank you very much. So we will circulate a brief summary report, and we'll share it with all the panelists, and the discussion outcomes that have been derived from today's discussion will also contribute to the ITF summit in 2022. And so if you're unfamiliar with the summit, this is our annual ministerial event, and we have a different theme every year. And next year, the theme is Transport for Inclusive Societies. So that is aligned with our side event today. And I hope we will have the opportunity again to have this dialogue and discussion in 2020 at our annual summit. And so with that,
live, please wait. Presently and live. You have to invite us presently.
Yeah, so at the moment, it is planned to be a physical meeting in Leipzig, Germany. And so we will definitely invite all of you to our annual summit. And we will also put all the panelists in touch if you would like to follow up for further discussions as well with one another.
Great. And just I mentioned a Medium article earlier that I wrote, and I just put that link in the chat here, just as a way to start thinking about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is definitely very helpful. And so are there any other final comments or questions? And no? Okay. So if not, I will now close this meeting and close this side event. It is our pleasure to have all of you with us today. And again, as I've mentioned, we will circulate the summary, and we hope to have this discussion with all of you again very shortly. Thank you.